In progress.
Good afternoon, esteemed participants. The topic for today is very important: economic sanctions, fundamentals, and responsibilities. It requires very wide perspective of the economy and finance systems. That is why we have selected very befitting faculties. Pramod Khandelwalji, who is the ex-Chief Compliance and Principal Officer of IndusInd Bank, and C.A. Sachendra Rai is our renowned faculty on such subjects. As we are somewhat aware that economic sanctions are an economic weapon in the hands of governments, and particularly in the context of their current strategy. By and large, it is observed that larger countries would put sanctions against the smaller countries. There are various kinds of purposes, and they cannot be enumerated, but we can only exemplify that many times to deal with the issue of money laundering, to deal with the issue of terrorist activities and financing of them. Such sanctions are imposed. They ultimately restrict the economic relations between the countries. In the past, India has from time to time placed economic sanctions in the context of Iraq, Iran, Somalia, North Korea. And in the recent times, there are many steps which are in the form of economic sanctions, either partly or fully, against China, including the Chinese technology applications. And one should refer to foreign trade policy of the government to go into the details of India's policy framework. With this background, I leave the proceedings to Shalini, who will formally introduce the learned faculties and take over the proceedings. Thank you very much, Shalini.
Thank you, sir. So we have with us Mr. Pramod Khandelwalji. He is a retired senior banker with over 4 decades of corporate experience. He has made his banking career beginning 1974, first with State Bank of India, then with IndusInd Bank. He has handled several banking functions: retail banking, corporate banking, rural banking, and SME banking, and also merchant banking activities. He has developed deep insights into the various banking activities. He has been the Chief Compliance Officer and Principal Officer of IndusInd Bank, and he retired at the end of 2017. He has rich experience in application of banking laws, regulations, and AML, CFT norms and guidelines in development of policies and processes in banking organization. He is an expert anti-money laundering and CFT professional. By qualification, he is an engineering graduate from IIT Kharagpur. Driven by his engineering education, his training programs are methodical and precise in content. He is a certified associate of Institute of Bankers and holds a diploma in business finance. He is a certified trainer from Cranfield Institute of Technology, United Kingdom. He has engaged in holding special in-house training programs in both the banks he had served. He is a guest faculty for several years at the Indian Institute of Banking and Finance. He is a senior faculty at Fintellect Bessie Institute, and he has also been a guest faculty at several banks for AML and compliance related programs. He has been a speaker and a panel discussion moderator at various AML summits and conferences in India, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. So we welcome you, sir. And then we have with us C.A. Sachendra Rai ji. He is a commerce graduate and by profession a chartered accountant of May 2003 batch. He has traveled a journey of professionalism full of adventure. He is an experienced banker and at present holding the position of Chief Compliance Officer and Chief of Internal Vigilance in a foreign bank. Besides CA, he possesses many degrees, professional certifications and diplomas such as CMA, LLB, CISA, CAMS, CA, IIB, etc. His 18 years of post-qualification experience, which include working with 16 years with banking industry and 2 years with accounting firms. His prior experience includes working in the role of internal auditor, money laundering reporting officer, and compliance officer. He's working as the chief compliance officer in a private bank. We welcome you, sir. I'll request Pramod Khandelwal, sir, to start with this session.
Thank you, Chairman Sir, Shri Tanuvyaji. Thank you, Shalini Gulati for your kind words. And thanks to my fellow speaker, Shri Satyendra Kumarji, to join me on this webinar session. At the outset, I would like to thank ICAI for giving me this opportunity of sharing my thoughts on economic sanctions. And I really compliment ICAI that it is in the field of spreading the significance of AML, CFT, and economic sanctions. Both go together in several aspects among the CA fraternity and among the commercial world also, apart from the financial world. This webinar, I'll just touch upon the background and the concepts part of it, while the nitty-gritties and the details of the various significant sanctions will be dealt with by my fellow speaker, Sri Satyendra Kumarji. Now, before I get on to this subject, as Shalini ji just mentioned, I started my banking career in 1974. At that point of time in banking, when we would talk about the word sanction, what would flash in our mind was sanction of a loan proposal, a credit proposal. And perhaps in those days, while India had several trade regimes and trade control was very much rigorous in India, but the word sanction globally was not so widespread known, particularly in India, because it was a closed economy as it is. And the sanctions today, after a lot of globalization and over the world also, the interconnected economies are seeing growth of international trade and international financial transactions. Sanctions naturally have become a major area to look for in compliance as part. And so the sanctions in the sense of controls, as the chairman had mentioned in his opening remarks, have now become something which all businesses, whether financial, commercial, trade, or investment, need to be really focusing attention on as a part of their own compliances. Now, sanctions, though I said in 74 was not really very much known, but it goes to really old age of the first type of sanction, it is said, was a Megarian decree sometime in BC 432. So that is 2,600 odd years before, where Athens, the Greek city republic, and their group had put certain sanctions on Megara, another neighboring city republic, because they cultivated some land which was held as a sacred land by these Greece Athenian society. And they banned them from using the harbors and markets to which access was available only to Athens city republic and its league, other city republics which were in their league. So that is supposed to be first known historical form of sanctions. Sanctions, of course, in several societies, even at the society level, they have been used for trying to keep certain persons deprived of certain connections socially. Sanctions in the form as we see currently can be perhaps tracked down to 1892, when Henry Lafontaine, who was himself a lawyer and he was a winner of Nobel Peace Prize, he had advocated that sanctions can be imposed in the international peace movement on those people who would be rather given to aggression, trying to control their aggressive postures. Moving on further, after the World War I, as you would be knowing, that Society of Nations was the first attempt as a precursor to the United Nations as of today. And that Society of Nations also thought of using sanctions in trying to isolate recalcitrant nations who would like to be disrupting the world peaceful relations and coordination. In fact, at that point of time, again, it was US President who had tried to promote the sanctions in 1949 with League of Nations and asking for absolute boycott of aggressor countries. Again, that was the era when there were several war fronts open. In 1940, between US and Japan, when rivalry was there, trade sanctions were imposed by the USA on Japan. When United Nations was formed in 1945, by that time, the tool of sanctions had sort of received a world consensus, and therefore the United Nations has in its charter itself enshrined that sanctions may be used whenever required as a part of UN tools to try to keep harmony and the cohesion in the world situation. 80s, there were sanctions related to two countries, Rhodesia and South Africa, which were controlled and governed by white minority government. And the tool used at that time was that the civil society groups called for divestment from those companies which were operating or which were providing services or operating in these two countries. So that was the use of sanctions against apartheid. Coming 1990, closer down our time, we find sanctions in variety of ways. Iraq sanction, which was first comprehensive sanction used by US, UN, and because the Saddam Hussein regime, and then at that time, again in Haiti, a different form of sanctions, which was not targeted towards the country, but certain officials, particularly the military officials, senior officials of Haiti. And simultaneously in that era, in those years, a different form of sanctions was in Angola, where the Angola rebels were taking control of the country, that sanctions against the blood diamond. And those in the diamond trade would be knowing that, yes, the particular type of trade practice in diamond is still continuing after that. Then in the new century, 21st century, we have sanctions taking form of counterterrorism sanctions, and United Nations had imposed sanctions against head of North Korea. And a very peculiar type of sanctions used by United Nations. You know, head of North Korea is really penchant for all luxury items. So sanctions of putting supply of luxury goods to North Korea was sanctioned. And Iran sanction, I cannot forget but mention that, which has really been world-changing, and it is continuing even today. It has seen seesaw situation. I think more on it will be dealt with by Sachin Dani. So if we look at the sanctions landscape today, what are the various reasons or factors for which sanctions are imposed by countries? It started with drugs and narcotics promotion initially, the promotion of weapons of mass destruction, the Iraq sanction was based related to that. Terrorism and terrorist financing is another aspect, and those of us who have been associated with the AML measures and FATF recommendations. In fact, one recommendation is specifically pertaining to the two UNSCR lists pertaining to the Al-Qaeda and Taliban, ISIL and Al-Qaeda terrorist organizations. And then political supremacy. Several of the sanctions, when you look at those details of the sanctions and whom they are targeted at, it is a significant idea that political supremacy is one of the objectives. A case in point could be the sanctions imposed by US on Russia, sectoral sanctions for Russia, and then control on natural resources. And here again, the Iran sanctions can be debated both ways, that what exactly or really, truly the objective of the Iran sanctions were. So do we call these as economic sanctions? Well, the sanctions have effect on the economic effect, severe economic effect most of the time, but the root cause behind the sanctions or the driving factors for these sanctions are mostly different, some other factors rather than just economic factors. And what can the goals of the sanctions be? I would broadly put it that the UN sanctions are mostly driven toward the international law enforcement, or what is desired on the international level to achieve that objective. Some of them could be influenced by some powerful nations, is one different aspect. But the other sanctions, and there are other than UN sanctions by several major economies, those are more of foreign policy tools, perhaps. And these sanctions, they really have the goals either social, commercial, or political, as we have just looked into. So the sanctions are of wide variety with different objectives, different purposes, but what ultimately really matters that wherever compliances are required, those are, of course, certain defined measures which we just look into shortly. How do these sanctions work out and affect on the targeted, or they are expected to? Whether they are effective finally or not has always been a debatable question. But these sanctions, depending on the form in which they are put, they seek to put either an economic pressure on those countries, or sometimes a non-economic but a strategic pressure by depriving them of certain resources, like where it is for sanctions against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and only particular military hardware, etc., would not be made available to them. So that's the non-economic pressure. Or resources denial, where resources for certain specific purposes, which were considered harmful, could be denied to them. In that sense, the sanctions are introduced with the objective of that the target country or the targeted person would move away from its course of behavior, and it would fall in line with the behavior expected by the sanctioning authority, in case of UN, by the group of nations together. That message to be sent down. And of course, the sanctions are targeted as those targets, and for the targets, the messages are there. But the sanctions compliances fall upon the players in the commercial world, in the financial world. And then for not really helping in observing those sanctions could lead to the punitive measures being taken by the authorities wherever those sanction they have and wherewithal of taking those measures. And that, of course, is exercised, and in case of US, it comes out really very clearly. What are the major sanctions which we are really bothered about in our regular operations and businesses? They could be taken on fingertips, which could be of major aspects. The United Nations, of course, and those are sanctions where all of us would be looking into. But the most, I would say, feared sanctions and most complex of sanctions are those emanating from USA, the OFAC sanctions as it is normally known in the commercial and business world. And then the UK have EU, both of them. Now, the sanctions by USA, UK, and EU, they imbibe sanctions of UN. Based on that, they introduce, but there's own sanctions apart from the UN sanctions. There are several sanctions with which USA and EU, and following EU, UK after Brexit has its own set. There are several others depending on their own commercial, political, economic interests. Canada and Australia also have certain set of sanctions which could be. So these are, but going forward, as certain economies become, there will be sanctions. By most of Hong Kong also has a set of sanctions which could be distinct from UN in addition to the UN sanctions, etc. In India, we have had sanctions in different forms, and today, yes, as mentioned again by the chairman, sir, that China, certain restrictions. So in the form of the trade control, India has been using some sort of sanctions measures, though not really announced as separately as a sanctions program. If we take the entire set of sanctions of various country sanctions and the UN sanctions, that is sanctions imposed by the independent jurisdiction, we could put them in certain categories. There are certain sanctions regimes which are targeted at a country, particular country, and for certain specific types of transactions with that country. Then there would be comprehensive country sanctions, and Iraq, Iran are two case in point. North Korea is another case in point, where comprehensive country sanctions, which literally means practically nothing is permitted except what is permitted on humanitarian grounds like food and medicines, etc. There are sectoral sanctions, specifically in case of, say, USSR, Ukraine, the petroleum sector and certain entities related to petroleum industry and supplies connected with the petroleum aspect. So that's the type of sectoral sanctions, only targeting some particular sector of particular jurisdictions. There is another form of sanctions, a part where it is not really connected with trade and economy as such, but it is targeted at individuals. Certain individuals against whom it is targeted, either for the reason of their indulgence in terrorism or terrorism financing related activity, or their indulgence in anti-democratic actions in their own countries. And so these sanctions, which are against certain designated persons, it could be either related to a country so sometimes as a part of country sanctions, apart from the sanctions against the country, certain trade aspects, also certain designated persons could be put for against whom the sanctions are targeted. So transactions with them would not be allowed. Designated persons on account of the organization with which they are connected, and the example would be the two UNSCR sanctions which I just mentioned about. Last but not least is that as excepting persons, because of their activity, they are taken and designated as a part of just specific category as designated persons. Within this realm of persons, while individuals are yes targeted, but it also includes sanctions against commercial entities, business organizations or other organizations. And lastly, it also includes, and these commercial entities will include banks or financial institutions also. And lastly, also vessels, ships. Then there are several vessels which have been put on sanctions list because of several aspects related to either they are being used for pirating or they are connected, they have been found to be violative of certain sanctions measures, and the vessels themselves have been put under sanctions. Now, what sort of restrictions are put in these sanctions, taking them on broad macro level? Ban on investments in the particular country or in the particular organization could be there. Trade embargo with the country, total trade embargo, or import of specific goods not permitted, or export of specific goods not permitted. Embargo on supply of arms and ammunition or weapons, etc. So the arms embargo. Ban on the financial services to be rendered. It could be targeted at the country, at the individuals, wherever, depending on the sanctions or regime of what sort it is. Financial support in form of either fund-based or non-fund-based facilities, etc., that could be prohibited. Freezing assets belonging to the individual or belonging to the entity, and restriction on travel by the individuals, persons where sanctions are targeted against individuals, a ban on their travel. So these are the various types of, so if you look at and examine, analyze all the sanctions regimes, the specific provisions would mostly be covered in one or the other of this category. So that is the whole regime of the sanctions which exists. Now, the action for businesses, that is non-financial businesses, and the financial institutions could have shades of difference. So putting them in, say, two categories. For businesses, essentially supplies of goods and services which are specifically prohibited, or any goods or service which could be used for any of the restrictions placed on that country or that individual, that is covered by the sanctions. Not only this, even facilitating such supplies of goods and services, that also is prohibited. So when a sanction is, say, on export of, one could say, crude petroleum to North Korea, it also would cover a restriction on facilitating export of crude petroleum to North Korea. So financial institutions, the sanctions on the financial services, so facilitating any financial services, including remittances or credit facility, fund-based, non-fund-based, whatever nature it is, or opening a bank there, or providing deposit service, all those specifically prohibited are prohibited. But even financial services for these prohibited activities or other prohibited activities, that also is implied in these sanctions. So for financial institutions, do not have to just look into what are the financial services prohibited. They would have to look into the entire sanctions, because even say where travel ban is there and financial services being provided for the purpose of in the form of the powers facilitating that person traveling on whom travel ban is there. That would need to be looked into. The persons who are covered under sanctions, specifically named persons, nationals, or entities, who are targeted, the target persons, but even the entities owned or controlled by such persons, so the beneficial owners or other direct owners of, if they are on these sanctions list, then these entities also could become subject to the sanctions. Now, what it implies and why should the businesses and financial institutions should be really taking care of that? Yes, they are within the four walls. Essentially, today's commercial financial world, the emphasis on this is because to be able to sustain the businesses with these jurisdictions who have imposed sanctions world over, the major economies, it's important that, yes, we observe that. Otherwise, the risk run is that the businesses, there will be disruption, the counterparties will not deal with us. So this has become very, very significant and important. So for commercial enterprises who are into different sectors, naturally their focus will be about what are the sanctions in the context of the business or sectors which they are into and they need to look into. Jurisdictions with which they deal, sanctions typically would apply in all cross-border deals. So if those jurisdictions, are they subject to sanctions, or are any individual entities of those jurisdictions are subject to sanctions? For financial institutions, as they deal with transactions covering all sectors and jurisdictions, naturally each financial sector will have its own set of sectors and jurisdictions. So they have to look into the totality of the sanctions regime. Therefore, for financial institutions, keeping update with all sanction regimes, and sanctions regimes are really dynamic. Particularly, some of the sanctions regimes keep on changing quite frequently. The sanctions list of designated persons definitely keeps on changing. But even a regime like Iran regime has seen a seesaw in the US with the changing political situation there. The financial institutions, they run the risk of, if not in case of non-compliance, they're subject to penalties and several restrictions. So what's the risk run particularly by financial businesses, financial institutions, but it could also apply to the commercial world. The financial risk, and losing the deal on the deal which was undertaken and it was subject to sanctions, it could mean your goods get blocked or the amount getting locked up with some US bank because the OPEC regime provides that, yes, it should be blocked. Could lead to legal risk with counterparties and the reputation risk, of course, when you make the headlines and then it impacts. And particularly in case of financial institution, the correspondent relationship. And the financial risk also runs in the form of penalties levied by the various authorities, more particularly US, the sanctions, fines, penalties are quite heavy. Now, what sort of violations take place? Potentially, the prohibited transaction with a sanctioned country or person being undertaken is a straight direct violation. But there could be an indirect and perhaps unwitting violation. It is received from US, say, and it is re-exported from here to another country which is subject to sanction of US. Now, that again will become a violation where perhaps it's happened unknowingly that yes, this sanction regime would be applicable to re-export of goods from another country as long as goods are of US origin. So such sort of violations. A non-US subsidiary of an organization which is outside the US, one would not imagine that OFAC sanctions may be applicable, but wait, they may be. And in that some cases, they may be violative of OFAC sanctions, which, when known, would lead to the various risks. So one needs to be really very, very careful in examining each and every sanction, that what is the scope of that sanction, what sort of transactions could fall into that sanction regime. The financial transactions by banks to or from a sanctioned country is a straight away would be undertaking a financial transaction for a sanctioned transaction. That is an angle which requires a little deeper probe by banks, financial institutions to look into, to be careful. So sanctions violations could arise from surprise from some other corner, which we need to be cautious about. This is just giving a little that in US, the sanctions fines 73%, the entire global sanctions fines is 56% for global fines. Globally, if you find this, of course, is not confined only to sanctions. The globally fines on banks, if one takes the analysis, the highest is the US, the Netherlands, Australia, and UK. It's 91% US. That's why the financial institutions are really very much worried when they are undertaking the US transaction. This just gives some pictograph for OFAC sanctions, and I know reading this could be difficult. If I'll just read out some major one. In 2012, HSBC had $1.9 billion of OFAC sanctions, while in 2014, BNP Paribas had $8.9 billion of US sanctions, and Commerce Bank have faced $1.46 billion of US sanction in 2015. And there are several. Let's just look at a few of the BNP Paribas $8.9 billion US sanction was in respect of sanctions related to Sudan, Iran, and Cuba. Cuba, by far, is, I would think, the oldest sanctions regime of US against Cuba, their neighboring country, which was most comprehensive. The only exception provided was because Cuba and US, they have several families separated and relatives staying across the border. So some little relaxation has been given in more recent time. For $8.8 billion of transactions which were concealed, the sanctions amount was so huge. HSBC, again related to Cuba, Iran, Libya, Sudan, and Burma, and drug proceeds handled. ING sanction was with Dutch PPS, not US OFAC, but again related to Cuban and Iranian entities, and 775 million euro. So for OFAC sanctions, essentially, Dutch regulatory authority has imposed. And these are all US sanctions and remittances to Sudan, Iran, and Sudan. And look at this, a little surprising thing, but unfortunately, yes, that it was found that Credit Suisse was facilitating the transfers by training Iranians to falsify the wire transfer messages. So that in the US banks, when they look into and examine the transaction, they are not able to come to conclusion that, yes, this is violating Iranian transaction. Again, Barclays tripling wire transfers for customers in Cuba and Iran. Standard Chartered also removing information from wire transfers. So some of these violations, of course, we cannot say that they happened by oversight. There was a design behind those violations for whatever reasons. The Standard Chartered Bank, unfortunately, yes, it had sanctions, a penalty both by US and UK, £102 million and $947 million. So totally exceeding $1.2 billion or so. Information received in respect of sanctions related to all these countries. In Dubai branch, 2009 to 14, 5 years transfers for Iran-linked accounts made. Again at Dubai branch, account opened with 500,000 GBP cash without obtaining any information on source. And this export transaction of items which could have military application, no sufficient information. So one could suspect that this could be terrorism-related transaction. And so the regime had, that's the view the regime had taken, the authorities, DOJ. Unicredit, 7 penalties from 2000 onwards, totaling 1.15 billion. Its German unit, Iranian transactions, non-transparent transactions, again dealing with hiding certain information so that it doesn't reveal that it is sanctioned, happening, a sanctioned transaction is being done. In Austrian unit, sanctioned entities to US system, circumventing Iran transaction. Embargo tool, which would highlight which are the non-compliant transactions so that those transactions could be taken care of in limiting in a manner so that flags would not be raised. Society General, $1.44 billion, 2000 onwards, so 20 years, of course, 22 years, 8 regime penalties total. Again, same, Cuba, Iran, Sudan, concealment, inaccurate, incomplete notation on transfer messages, internal communications, asking for obfuscating information messages. The things investigations begin, then everything gets revealed. In most of these cases, the sanctions in the US particularly are the negotiated ones, the entities once caught, and then they, without admitting, okay, they will agree to pay the certain penalties and perhaps escape the criminal penalty provisions of the regime. But the fact remains that yes, whatever business would have been done by resorting to those practices, ultimately all that profit is being taken away by the authorities by way of penalties, plus the reputation losses, of course, each business organization gauges for itself. So what is required when I need to comply with sanctions, whatever regime it may be? I need to focus on what are the items I need to look at from the point of view of the sanctions. If I would consider, and this could apply to, though this is from financial institution perspective, I think this will equally apply to other businesses. Onboarding a customer or dealing with any customer who is a domestic customer, essentially I need to look at the customer. The transactions, as long as they are domestic transactions, so domestic regime naturally I take care of, and the application of the, and this will be within domestic financial system, so application of the US or UK or EU sanctions should normally not be bothering me so much. The moment I deal with a customer who is a foreign customer, then I need to look at the designated list for the customer as well as the country sanctions related to. So from where the customer is he subjected to those country sanctions, falls under those regimes. So this is dealing with the counterparty related sanctions as applicable to the counterparty. As coming to the transactions with these counterparties, they could be the trade transaction. Now, any trade transaction, I will naturally have to have counterparty, the buyer, the importer or exporter, would need to look into the sanctions about that, and the counterparty would be in a different country. So I would also need to look from country sanction perspective and the designated list. The vessels, are they on the designated list and do they fly under the different country sanctions. The bank and other intermediaries who would be related in the transactions, they could be in whatever role and capacity, the insurance companies, merchant agents, etc. Goods, services, dealing with that country, in country sanctions, what regimes could be applicable. Similarly, in case of investments, I would be looking into the parties from the designated list perspective and for the entire transaction from the country perspective. That yes, what is permitted for that country, what is not permitted. Investments in particular sectors may be permitted, or investment, there may be blanket ban of investment in that country. And there may be ban on accepting investment from the counter country. So even for the foreign investment, FDI transaction also I would need to look into. Financial support in the form of either external commercial borrowing or trade credit could be impacted, where the financial support is banned, and of course, the counterparty related specific designated lists, whatever restrictions are there on any of the persons connected, are they there? And for other remittances like personal remittances, etc., also the country to which it is permitted, not permitted. For example, Cuba, everything was not permitted. Now some small amounts of personal remittances are being permitted, subject to a lot of restrictions, per month only so much, in a year only so much amount, etc. So when I deal with sanctions, I have to look into multiple regimes and regulations. All these checks need to be done prior to the execution of transactions and of all the elements, because I cannot undertake, I should not undertake a transaction if it is covered by the regime, can impact the customers funds are locked. Transactions not necessarily. Now in sanctions, the transactions are not necessarily crime changing. The criminals could use also certain transactions for sanctions, chances will be very less. The risk, of course, is the correspondent banks may not deal if they find that quite often I am entering or I am really forwarding transactions which are violative of sanctions. De-risking by correspondent banks could happen. The regulators, of course, they will levy penalty. In case of AML-CFT, what one looks at is the domestic and the host country regulation. If I have foreign officers, the host country and the host domestic. The pre-onboarding check is only for the customer. The transactions are examined from the AML perspective after the transactions. And here invariably, of course, either the crime money is involved or the ultimate use will be for terrorism purpose. The impact of risk, of course, arises from both the regulators and correspondent banks, the de-risking they will need to take. So this just gives that. Now, essentially, in case of AML-CFT, there is a responsibility not to tip off, and the judgment is more assessment-based, based on the several norms of money laundering, terrorism financing. One tries to make a sense whether it could be related to money laundering, terrorism financing. In case of sanctions, it's a very prescriptive regime, and applicability of that prescriptive, so criteria-based decision is there, and the customer has to be informed. If I do not undertake a transaction for the customer, the financial institution has to inform the customer that yes, this transaction on account of this restriction cannot be undertaken. That refusing. So this is, and pre-execution check is vital here. So these are the differences in the two aspects, but in both the cases, the transaction examination and diligence becomes important, and the responsibility is right from the board level, who need to look into policy and overall watch. Then assurances by ACB, who looks into that periodically. They will look into several reports pertaining to sanctions, that things are on track. The actual action is in these places, the business functions, the customer and diligence, and verification in respect of transaction details, while the operations would look into the actual sanctions regime, counterparty, intermediary checks, etc. And sanctions compliance would really take care of all the specific sanctions to be looked into. So operations function and the sanctions compliance, they really closely work hand in hand to look into the aspect of whether the transaction is doable. So naturally, customer due diligence, transaction monitoring, and event-based screening, all of these become important in respect of both sanctions as they apply to the AML regime also. So essentially the core of the operation responsibilities with the sanctions team. The sanctions team need complete information about the transaction, all documents with all details, and then only they can really come at the proper judgment, and they will be looking into alert for any red flag with support of IT systems, etc. So the front line has to be very diligent, provide all possible information, verify all information to the extent they can, and the central processing unit needs to take care that yes, all relevant information is together, and in case of wire transfers, be very, very particular. Complete information is there, as we have seen several penalty cases in respect of wire transfers with Visa. So what causes actually any violations? Forget the deliberate violations, that of course is a different story altogether, but there are violations which happen being activity being decentralized. So it's important to have the setup in such a way that all persons and functionaries dealing with these transactions, which are subject to sanctions regime, are appropriately trained. They have appropriate support of the system, appropriate support of sanctions information, and they know what all information to be gathered about the customer and the transactions. The non-standard payment processes, if they are being used, that could lead to certain problems. So things have to be so standardized that sanctions can become foolproof. The evasion techniques, which could be used by the institutions, which could be used by the customers, and so one needs to guard against these evasion techniques. And these could be use of shell companies, routing transaction via third countries or third parties, full information not being given, weaker financial institution being the counterparty, then one needs to be careful. The description of goods or places is too vague, too wide, not very precise and specific, as it should be in any commercial transaction, more particularly cross-border, the import-export transaction. Using SPVs to hide the real ownership or to whom it is really going, or routing to third person or third country under some excuses, but really it is meant to violate or obfuscate certain. So knowing the ultimate beneficial owner would be very important. Knowing about the existence of the entity, the track history, the transaction is in consistency with the occupation or activity of the parties, bona fides of the counterparty, that would be really quite important to take a total view on how the transaction is. And that could also mean that even in transaction examination where sanctions are to be taken into account, the purpose to be understood appropriately on the other country, very important aspect will be about dual use, which is a very tricky area because there the claim will be it is for peaceful purpose and usual productive purpose, while it may be really a hidden way of for using for proliferation purpose. Looking at the intermediary's reputation could be important. The home country due diligence of the counterparty, that could be quite important. The trade terms, are they the usual trade terms? These could be important. So thank you, friends. I'll hand over the baton to Sanctions ji for continuing. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramodji, for your insightful session. It was quite good knowledge on the basics of the sanctions and how it is work and all. I will be covering the part of OFAC sanction compliance program and economic sanction due diligence. So this is the part which is practically what we do, what is relevant, how this impact banking and financial institutions and other institutions as well. Because after 9/11 event, the US has tightened its control over the transactions done in the USD and to put more stringent rules and sanctions to deter this terrorist financing and to establish the peace in US and in around the world. So these are the content which I'm going to cover. The result of increased OFAC scrutiny. The OFAC scrutiny has increased multifold after the 9/11 event. Then the expansion of scope of OFAC sanctions, OFAC sanction compliance program. Then we have one case study. Content of OFAC sanction compliance program. This first time when OFAC come up with a framework on sanctions compliance, and they have given uh, detailed sanction compliance program which company or industry or financial institutions can implement it, which will help them to deter or mishappening or processing any transactions which are in violation of OFAC sanctions. Then there are sanction screening best practices. We have two case studies, and then root cause of OFAC sanctions compliance program breakdowns or deficiency based on the assessment of prior OFAC administrative actions. So these are the content which we are going to cover. The result of increased OFAC scrutiny. So every year, the U.S. Treasury Department casts a wider net of Office of Foreign Assets Control violations, ensuring everyone from unwitting small business to sophisticated large corporates. The continual expansion of a global economy that trades increasingly online across international borders and through digital currency is driving the Treasury's dedicated efforts to ensure all US businesses, including any foreign subsidiaries, comply with the OFAC regulations that aim to thwart illicit activity and terrorism. As I mentioned, that recently the Treasury's efforts gained even more steam when the OFAC issued an official sanction compliance program framework for the first time. It was issued in 2019, May 2nd, 2019, and shortly thereafter, OFAC begins regularly referencing this framework in its enforcement actions. So whenever there is enforcement actions, they try to match that whatever they have prescribed. The one is their sanction program and their sanction list, the sanction program, country based sanction, list based sanction, etc. Then they compare that what sort of control a particular organization is having to ensure that there is no violations on their sanction program. So that also they have prescribed. They benchmark if organization which have put in place a comprehensive compliance sanction program, in that case if there is any violation in terms of their sanctions, so their leniency is observed from the OFAC side while calculating the penalty to be levied on the particular organizations. So we have seen the increased scrutiny by OFAC, and it's resulted into there are a couple of points which I have mentioned here, that a single OFAC fine now usually equals or even dwarf the
So
total
your
amount.
screen is not moving.
Pardon? Is
The PPTs are not, the slides are not moving.
so I'm on this slide. The result of increased OFAC scrutiny is the slide is there.
No, sir, the slide is not moving. You can withdraw and share again.
Title slide.
Yeah, now it is there.
So it's visible now.
Yes, sir, it is visible now.
Okay. So other business types are just as likely as traditional banks to incur the large I think there is some problem. So is this slide is visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is visible.
Okay, okay, thank you. So we hear that after 9/11 event, then they have made certain changes in US Patriot Act, and they have broadened the definition of financial institutions in order to highlights the industries that by very nature are higher risk of money laundering and of act violations. Those industries include, like, if you see the vehicle dealers and vehicle part suppliers. So under US Patriot Act, automobile, boat and motorcycle dealers are deemed financial institution because OFAC knows that sanctioned parties can easily launder money through the purchase of such vehicles. If we can recall the third layer of the money laundering, that is integration, when a person is successfully laundered his money and try to withdraw the money from the financial institution, then where they go and invest? They go and buy the luxury uh, cars, boats, yachts, etc. So keeping in view that they have brought this vehicle dealers and vehicle part suppliers within the definition of the financial institution. Airplane and their parts are critical for terrorists and other sanctioned entities, allowing them to run their operations and expand their organizations beyond isolated area. A large aerospace service provider was fined 50.9 million US dollar for re-exporting aircraft part. Next industry is the casino. Then they have the insurance. Then they've included the real estate and construction related firms. In real estate and construction related firm, uh, anyone involved in real estate, including the real estate or settlement agent and title insurance or escrow companies, is prohibited from engaging in any transaction involving an SDN, especially designated nationals, and is required to freeze any SDN assets placed in their accounts. This is true for new purchases, refinances, and any other real estate dealings. Even homeowners associated are liable for OFAC violations. As 900 USD civil monetary penalty provided in case where an association used the proceeds of sale of an SDN's real property. So they have extended the implication of OFAC sanctions even to individuals, wherein if the individual has used money of property sold by SDN, then that particular individual will also be liable for a fine under the OFAC. Then next one is travel and tourism. In travel and tourism also there have been four multi-million dollar fines levied against the travel services providers since 2006, along with the several smaller but not insignificant fines. Interactions between a travel agent and an SDN can be as obvious as the purchase of the travel service. However, there are other more obscure interactions that travel agent, ticket agents, tour companies, airlines companies, hotel operators, and even promoters must be on the guard against, including the following. Just for example of penalties levied by the OFAC on the travel and tourism industry, an international travel company fined 5.99 million for processing unauthorized travel related services. A travel assistance company fined 5.86 million US dollar for providing services in a sanctioned country. Travel agency fined 5.2 million for the booking travel to sanctioned countries. So these are just for an example. What uh, the This is just for an example to see that how the OFAC has gone ahead and penalizing not only the banks but other industries as well. Then importer and exporter. Importer and exporter is one of the very important leg of the international trade and international banking. So in OFAC terms, this categories covers a broad array of the businesses and may include yours if it has any involvement whatsoever in importing or exporting the goods or services. So to all the parties who are involved in import and export of goods and services are under the scanner of the OFAC. OFAC examines four factors when investigating possible import or export violation, and these are very important, particularly for importer and exporter and as well as for the banking and financial institution. The first thing is the destination. Is the import going to, or is the import coming from a sanctioned country? That is the first question. Then end user, who is going to use? Are any of the party who will use the product named on the SDN list? Then third thing is sale service. Is any party to the sanction, that like shippers, insurer, bank, etc., named on the SDN list, even if the transaction is otherwise legitimate? So if an import or export transaction is legitimate, the importer is in a country which is not a sanctioned country, the exporter is in a country which is not a sanctioned country, they are doing the legitimate business, the product they are selling or buying is a legitimate one, everything is right, everything is not in violation of any of the guideline, But if the parties involved to that, like shipper, logistics company, or the vessels, or the owner of the vessels, or even the bank, if everything is fine, but even the bank, the transaction is processing through a bank which is in the SDN list, so that will be a violation of a OFAC sanctions. Then end use. Will the product be used for legitimate purpose, or could it be used for terrorism, narcotics trafficking, or in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? Here in trade-based money laundering, generally we see that we check in a bank, the check is run that whether the product which is imported or exported by a particular party is of dual use. If the product is of dual use, for example, if the particular product is used for making a medicine, and the same product being may be used for making an explosive, so this product is of dual use. A particular person or a company, if importing that particular product, it is an obligation on the bank to see what is the requirement of a company. Suppose as per the estimates, annually a company consumes
Sir, again, your slide is not changing.
so this slide, I am that slide only, just I am explaining expansion of scope of Act sanction, right? Is this slide visible, Shalini?
You are right, Sachin ji. You are explaining the scope of import.
Visible.
Yeah. So I'm just explaining the scope of scope of expansion of the OFAC sanctions. So I am here, and uh, fourth last point, importer and exporter. This is very important from the point of view of the financial institution, and also as well as anybody who is involved in the international trade. And we have seen huge penalties levied by the OFAC. A couple of example I have, like pharmaceutical lab fined 76 lakh 17,150 US dollar for exporting surgical product. Dental equipment firm fined 12 lakh 20,400 for selling goods to distributor dealing in a sanctioned country. Then small medical supply firm fined uh, 5 lakh 15,400 for willfully exporting goods to a sanctioned country. So this way, not only the banking and financial institution, but everybody, anybody and everybody who is involved in international trade, whether importer or exporter, or any are providing any ancillary services to them. Next one is jewelry, precious gems, and metal dealers. So, jewelry and luxury goods dealer was fined 3,44,800 in case where the information and documentation provided to the company about the buyer matches with the name and address and the country location of a SDN list. But the company did not identify any sanction related issues with the transactions prior to shipping the goods. So at the time prior to shipping the goods, the company was not aware that to, to whom the goods were being shipped falls under the SDN list. Later they came to know, but they can't do anything. The goods have been shipped. OFAC levied a penalty of 3,44,800 US dollar. Then we have a money service business. Next target. One money service business was fined 4 lakh 40 lakhs 4 lakh 1,697 US dollar because one of its agent bank established a sub-agent relationship with a sanctioned entity. Other recent fines against the money service businesses ranges from 8,720 to 40,160 US dollar. Then next target is non-profit and charitable entities. These are like susceptible to money laundering as well. We have seen that in one instance, a well-established non-profit making company was fined 7,80,000 for knowingly and willfully transferring fund to sanctioned countries, and in another, the director of a small non-profit foundation was individually fined for USD 10,000 for unauthorized travel related transactions during business travel to a sanctioned party. So generally what people do, like Iran, Syria, or the comprehensively sanctioned country, just as a help to the people, on the pretext of the helping the people, funds are being transferred using the non-profit or charitable organizations. So that is also under the radar of OFAC, and is being monitored very closely, and they were able to levy a penalty on that. Now, OFAC sanction compliance program. OFAC sanction compliance program prohibits transactions and require the blocking of assets of a person and organizations that appears on one of a series of lists that OFAC issues periodically. OFAC has a power to impose significant penalties on those who are found to be in violation of the blocking orders within each of the sanction program. There's one case study which is here. In 2014, OFAC reached the record 963 million settlement with BNP Paribas, which just the Pramodji has explained. Following 8.9 billion penalty imposed for apparent violation of US sanctions regulations. The settlement resolved OFAC's investigation into BNPP's systematic practice of concealing, removing, omitting, or obscuring reference to information about US sanctioned parties in almost 4,000 financial transactions routed to or through US bank between 2005 and 2012 in apparent violation of US sanctions involving Sudan, Iran, Cuba, and Burma. BNPP's methods for processing sanction related payments to or through the United States, including removing references to sanctioned parties, replacing sanctioned parties with BNPP's names or a code word, or otherwise structuring the in a matter that did not identify the involvement of sanctioned parties in the transactions. So the content of OFAC sanction compliance program, the first one is management commitment, then risk assessment, internal controls, testing and auditing, and training. So we'll quickly go one by one for all these five. What is the expectation of OFAC when they say industry or a financial institution to implement this OFAC compliance sanction compliance program? The senior management has reviewed and approved the organization's sanctions compliance program. The first requirement is that there should be a top management, like board approved sanction compliance program, a policy in place. The senior management ensure that its compliance units are delegated sufficient authority and autonomy to deploy its policy and procedure in a manner that effectively controls the organization's OFAC risk. As a part of this effort, senior management ensure the existence of direct reporting line between sanction compliance program functions and the senior management, including the routine and the periodic meeting between these two elements of the organizations. This is a very important part of governance model as well. Senior management has taken and will continue to take the step to ensure that the organization's compliance unit receives adequate resource, including in the form of human capital, expertise, information technology, and other resources as appropriate, that are relative to organization's breadth of operations, target and secondary market, and other factors affecting its overall risk profile. Senior management promotes a culture of compliance throughout the organizations. When they say that senior management promotes a culture of compliance. So these are the qualitative statement, but when it comes to the assessment by the enforcement agency, the organization or the finance institution needs to demonstrate how the senior management is promoting a culture of compliance. Senior management demonstrate recognition of the seriousness of the apparent violation of the law and regulation administered by OFAC or malfunctions, deficiencies, or failure by the organization and its personnel to comply with the sanction compliance policies and procedures, and implement necessary measures to reduce the occurrence of apparent violation in the future. Such measures should address the root cause of the past apparent violation and represent a systematic solution wherever possible. So here the expectation is that if any violation noticed within the organization by the sanction compliance officer or by the risk officer or by anybody within the bank, the necessary measures needs to be taken. Like if a person is willfully doing a particular transaction which involve sanctions violations, then the particular person should be punished. Necessary training should be imparted. So this is what is the expectations of the sanction compliance program. The second is risk assessment. Assessment is a very important factor for the control functions, be it compliance, be it AML, be it sanctions, be it anything. So we have seen that recently in India, it was implemented that all the banking and financial institutions needs to conduct annual risk assessment on money laundering and terrorist financing. Likewise, for compliance also, it is a requirement that we need to conduct compliance risk assessment at least annually. So likewise, for anti-bribery and anti-corruption also there is best practices that we need to conduct the ABAC risk assessment. Likewise, for sanction also it is very important to conduct the risk assessment of sanctions. Risk assessment per se that what is the inherent risk, what are the control we have put in place, and then what are the residual risks, and to address the residual risk, what are the actions required. So this is the process of conducting risk assessment. The organizations conducts or will conduct an OFAC risk assessment in a manner and with a frequency that adequately accounts for the potential risk. Such risk could be posed by its clients and customers, products, services, supply chain, intermediaries, counterparties, transactions, and geographic locations, depending on the nature of the organizations. As appropriate, the risk assessment will be updated to account for the root cause for any apparent violation or systematic deficiency identified by the organization during the routine course of business. The organization has developed a methodology to identify, analyze, and address the particular risk it identifies. As appropriate, the risk assessment will be updated to account for the conduct and the root cause of any apparent violations or systematic deficiencies identified by the organization during the routine course of business, for example, through testing or audit functions. Next one is internal control. The organization has designed and implemented written policies and procedures outlined in the sanction compliance program. The policy and the procedures are relevant to the organization, capture the organization's day-to-day operations, and the procedures are easy to follow and designed to prevent the employee from the engaging in the misconduct. So the policy and procedures should be drafted such a way that it should be like easy to understand and easy to follow, and help if a particular employee is following the particular policy or the procedure, the employee will not lead to violating the sanctions. The organization has implemented internal control that adequately address the result of its OFAC risk assessment and profile. The internal control should enable the organizations to clearly and effectively identify, interdict, escalate, and report to appropriate personnel within the organization transactions and activities that may be prohibited by OFAC. To the extent information technology solutions factor into the organization's internal controls, the organization has selected and calibrated the solution in a manner that is appropriate to address the organization's risk profile and compliance needs, and the organizations routinely tests the solution to ensure the effectiveness. So conducting a compliance test or conducting an audit is again a very important part of the internal control to test that if a particular control, if it designed properly and is effective. The organization enforces the policy and procedures it implement as a part of its OFAC compliance internal control through internal and or external audits. The organization ensures that the OFAC related record keeping policies and procedure adequately account for its
Sir, your voice
by
is
OFAC.
breaking.
The organization in its internal control. I think this is okay. Now it is okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, now you're audible.
Okay. The organizations has clearly communicated the sanction compliance policies and procedures to all relevant staff, including personnel within the sanction compliance program, as well as the relevant gatekeepers and business units operating in the high risk area. So this is all. This is again a very important part of the sanction compliance program, that what you may be having a very good policy, you may be having a very good procedures, but until and unless the policy and procedure is communicated to the end user, it's useless. And just communication is not enough. You need to provide necessary training to the person, not only once but as and when there is an update. So ideally there should be one annual refresher training, and at least one training at a time of the joining of the staff. The organization has appointed personnel for interacting the sanction compliance program policies and procedures into the daily operations of the company or corporation. The process includes consultation with the relevant business units and confirm the organization's employee understand the policies and practices. So whenever we conduct trainings, generally we conduct understanding tests just to know that the people who have attended the training have got some understanding at what have been talked to during the, the tenure of the training. So that is also important to know that whether people are like giving due attention to a training or not. Now the last one is on training. So the organizations commits to ensure that its OFAC related training program provides adequate information and instruction to employee and as appropriate stakeholders, for example clients, supplier, business partners and counterparties, in order to support the organization's OFAC compliance effort. Such training should be further tailored to high risk employee within the organization. And who are the high risk employee? Particularly the relationship manager who is interacting directly with the customer, that is one high risk employee. The second was the person who is processing the transaction is another high risk employee. The third one, the person who is sitting in the compliance department and giving the clearance for any sanction hit. So these three are the high risk employee within organizations. The organization commits to provide OFAC related training with the scope that is appropriate for the product and services it offers, the customers, clients, partners relationship it maintains, and the geographic regions in which it operates. So this is also an important factor while designing your training program, that the organization should know that which all area where organization operate, from where, what all the geography to which the organization is catering. Accordingly the sanction training program will differ. The organizations commits to provide OFAC related training with the frequency that is appropriate based on the OFAC risk assessment and the risk profile. The organization commits to ensure that upon learning of confirmed negative testing result or the audit finding or other deficiency pertaining to its sanction compliance program, It will take immediate and effective actions to provide training to or other corrective actions with respect to the relevant personnel. The organization's training program include easily accessible resources and materials that are available to all the applicable personnel. So many a time it is debated that what should be the mode of the providing the training. So one is the classroom training. Classroom training is the best training, and it should not be within the premises of the organization. Generally, an off-site training and classroom training is the best effective training. Apart from that, e-learning maybe should be there for ready reference. The recorded training should be there whenever any staff needs to recall. He can go and just listen the recording and able to recall. Then here we are going to talk about best screening some screening best practices. So first one is use outsource list update. So how to use outsource list update? One is that if suppose there is a small organizations, you can just go and subscribe to OFAC SDN list. So whenever their list is updated, they used to send an email, and you can maintain a database. For bigger organization, you can there are service provider which provide you the consolidated list of all the sanctions. For example, we have Dow Jones, then we have Refinitiv. They provide the sanction list all across the globe. Maybe it's by a group of nations, or maybe by individual country like US, or group of nations like UNO or Security Council or EU. So they provide a consolidated list which can be used by the organizations. Automate the screening process. Of course, it is not viable that before processing transaction you go and manually you check. So automation of the screening process is essential element of the best practices which should be there, which should be implemented. Then support of multiple integration method. Multiple integration method, for example, if you are processing a transaction, suppose there is import transaction or there is export transactions. So what all you need to check? Just we have seen that the destination, the party involved, the bank, the shipper, the logistic company, the vessels. So the system should be integrated such a way that if all the relevant party is screened properly. Then leverage advanced word machine technology. This is while screening we can use mix and match, so that the possibility of passing true hit is less. Then use an on-demand solution. On-demand solution again, as well as in when you increase your product, you increase your services, you need to screen those particular services and relevant parties to that, relevant product to that, if that particular product or services falls within the sanction by OFAC or any other applicable sanctions. Sanction due diligence, onboarding and periodical review of the clients. So this is one of the very important point from the point of view of banking and financial institutions. When we onboard a client, at that particular point of time, we need to conduct a due diligence, maybe enhanced due diligence, and again it's on a periodical basis also. We need to conduct a due diligence. So who do the business in comprehensive sanction countries or the regions? So if you are onboarding a client who also does business with the comprehensive sanction countries, then you need to factor in that this customer is posed to a sanction risk. For example, if there is a kirana store who is importing dry fruits from Iran, so that expose the financial institution to a sanction risk. Then who should do within a bank or within the banking and financial institution, who should do this review or at the time of onboarding or a periodical review for the sanctioned parties or the parties who are doing business with the sanctioned countries as well. So if you are a client facing or and are responsible for ensuring complete the KYC. So these are the RMs, relationship manager of banking and financial institution. If you are completing or gathering the KYC forms and procedures, so this is basically client onboarding team in a bank, and then KYC owner, KYC support, client onboarding team. So these are the personnel within banking or financial institutions who should do this review. uh, we have when the client response is affirmative to the sanctions questions, the following questionnaires should be asked. Suppose if you are onboarding a client and we say that yes, we do some business from a comprehensively sanctioned country, maybe Crimea, maybe Syria, or maybe Iran, then you should ask that provide a percentage of the total business activity in or with each comprehensive sanction jurisdictions. So these are 5 comprehensively sanctioned jurisdictions, and you can ask that to describe the nature of business activity in or which comprehensively sanctioned jurisdictions, like revenue, import export, uh, number of projects you have, any other information. Then provide a percentage of the business activity compared with the overall like revenue, import export, or number of project. Is this activity expected to increase, decrease, or remain stable in next 12 months? So this is the information which relationship manager or a person from a bank should obtain from the customer to assess the sanction risk associated with that particular client which you are going to onboard. The second question, does the client rely on a general or a specific OFAC license or other authorizations to conduct its business in comprehensively sanctioned jurisdictions? So there is a provision that OFAC provide you license. If you apply and if you want to do trade with the comprehensive sanctioned country, you can apply to OFAC by giving all the necessary particular, and they can give you a license or the authorizations. Okay, you can do business with this with sanction commercial sanction country with such a volume as they permit. So this is the second question. If any customer says that yes, they are doing transaction or business with comprehensively sanctioned country, then this is the second question. If yes, then provide a license or authorization utilized. If no, then please provide legal basis for client's business with a comprehensively sanctioned jurisdiction. So if the particular client is doing the business, either the client will be having authorization or license from a fact to do such businesses, or the client needs to provide a legal basis on which they are doing the business with a comprehensively sanctioned country. Then third question is, does the client use or intend to use bank to facilitate a transaction involving the comprehensively sanctioned jurisdiction? So this is also a possibility that customer can say that yes, we do business with a comprehensively sanctioned country, but we are not going to route any of those transactions through your bank. If they say yes, they are going to route, then you can ask that provide the details. If not, then you can ask that describe the controls that the clients maintains for ensuring that its activity in the sanctioned jurisdictions are ring fenced from the processing through the bank's product services. And if not, then provide the names and locations of the financial institution that will be responsible for that. So we have the second case study, a relationship manager in a private bank. You are onboarding a new client whose business dealing once extended to Iran. When asked, the new client explains that previously 23% of their sales involved export to Iranian customers. However, this business was conducted in 2015. The client indicates that one of their primary purpose of tobacco leaves, the primary supplier of tobacco leaves is a French company that moved its headquarters to Havana 2 years ago, but that this supplier only accounts for 30% of the new client business operations. What should happen next? The follow-up sanction questionnaire should be provided. The three questions which we just seen in the previous slides to the KYC owner, and they should complete the questionnaire. The KYC owner should contact the client to obtain any necessary information. When the questionnaire has been completed, the KYC file should be escalated to the sanction compliance team. If the business with Iran was discontinued in 2015 and there have been no further transaction whatsoever, then confirmation of such is all that is required. If the concluded business with Iran continues to account for revenue or some other ongoing operations, the client should explain. The explanation should identify the nature of the goods or services being sold to Iran, the value of those sales, and the proportion of overall revenue derived from those sales to Iran. Also, the customer should clarify the location and identify their Iranian customer whether these sales were permissible under OFAC sanctions. So, the French supplier is operating within Cuba. So, this is related to the previous one, the situation case history which we have taken. Another comprehensive sanction jurisdiction. So, the supplier may be blocked under the OFAC sanctions program targeting Cuba, and consequently, the bank may not be able to provide client access to its product or services. The KYC owner must review the sale of goods to the client to determine if they are allowable under existing Cuba sanction program. This may include, for example, determining if the supplier is considered as a Cuban national or identifying applicable licenses that would allow the supplier sale of goods. So this is a follow-up questionnaire which the three questions which RM should or the KYC owner should ask from the client and fill in here. So I have just filled in just for example, the first one is the one in the Cuba. There was a transaction. Client purchases tobacco leaves from the Cuba, and 30% of the order derived from a company based on the Cuba, equaling approximately 30 million, and expected to remain stable for the next 12 months. And the second transaction is they are doing the comprehensively sanctioned countries, sale of cigarettes to the importer in Iran. As the tobacco in Tehran, a private company, concluded with no further revenue of the transaction since 2015. Zero business conducted in 2015. So, there is no foreseen business that they are going to do. That is not applicable. This is first questions. Second one, does the client rely on the general or specific license or other authorization to conduct his business in comprehensively sanctioned jurisdiction? If so, provide a license or other authorizations utilized. Client is not an US person, is not using US dollar, has no nexus to the US. Goods are imported into third country and substantially altered for a additional use before being sold onwards. Third question, does the client use or intend to use the bank to facilitate the transaction involving the comprehensively sanctioned jurisdictions? If yes, please provide detail. The answer is that client will not be using bank for purchase or other vendor related transactions. The client has an open line of credit for vendor transactions through a separate financial institution. So, basis on answer of these three questions, the financial institution needs to assess the risk and put the appropriate control. Third case study is a large shipping company named Logistics by Sea Inc. LBSI is existing commercial bank client. LBSI provides shipping services all over the world with no known internal policy restrictions on the part of the geographic location it may service. LBSI operates several vessels, ships, and employ directly and indirectly contractor, contingent worker, seamen, and sailors to on those ships. During the KYC renewal, the KYC owner asks LBSI whether whether it conducts any business with an individual or the entity in a comprehensively sanctioned country, Crimea, Iran, Cuba, North Korea, or Syria. LBSI states that it does. LBSI states that it make payments to the seller who are resident in the Crimea and visit the port of Latakia in Syria. Notably, LBSI's website also confirms that LBSI calls on the port in Latakia. LBSI states that it utilizes its account with the bank to facilitate the transactions for or on behalf of its subsidiary. The bank does not bank LBSI's subsidiaries. So the analysis of the case, I will read it out. As LBSI has confirmed that it has exposed to the comprehensive sanctions countries or the regions, the KYC owner seeks the client's input in addressing and filling out of follow-up sanction questionnaire. The KYC owner should collect the volume and the value of the transaction, including the transactions for subs and affiliates, seeking as much detail as possible. The clients dealing with the sanctioned countries so that there is no need to go back to the client for lack of information. Based on the responses from the client, the KYC owner should be aware that there are the several sanctions concerns and sanctions compliance will likely reach out to for the further discussion. Based on the answer provided below, the file should not be approved without further guidance from the sanction compliance. The file should be escalated to the sanction compliance risk expert for further guidance. So these are the questions which answered filled by the relationship manager. So just I am skipping that. We have seen the similar questions in the previous case. Quickly, I have 4 FAQ generally asked by the people. Can the relationship manager confirm yes or no for enhanced questions given their broader view oversight? So relationship manager knows yes or no, but can relationship manager itself confirm? The relationship manager can answer on behalf of the client, but he or she must have the answer confirmed by the client. So on their own they cannot confirm. The relationship manager cannot rely on the best of his or her knowledge in order to answer the questions on behalf of the client. Second question is that the questionnaire may be time consuming to complete. Is this required for KYC or it is more transaction specific? So this is required for KYC and not for transactions. If the client has operations in or transactions involving comprehensively sanctioned jurisdictions, the sanction compliance will need to assess the client ability to utilize the bank's product for such business. What action will the client be required to take? So this will be assessed on case by case basis and depend on the size of exposure. The standard remediation approach will be for the bank to send a letter to the client to confirm and notify the clients of bank's restrictions in relation to the transaction with the sanction target. Fourth question is this a new client onboarding requirement or is it required every periodical review or refresh of KYC of the client? So this review is requirement apply both for the new client onboarding and at the time of the periodical review as well. So these are the root cause for OFAC sanction compliance program breakdowns or deficiency based on the assessment of prior OFAC administrative actions, lack of formal OFAC sanction compliance program, misinterpretation, facilitating transactions by non-US person, exporting or re-exporting US origin goods, utilizing the US financial sanctions systems or processing the payments to or through US financial institution, sanctions screening software or filter faults, import due diligence or customer clients, decentralized compliance functions and inconsistent application of sanction compliance program, utilizing non-standard payment or commercial practices and individual liability. So wherever there is no individual liability, people don't behave sensibly. And these are the list of the penalty which are levied by OFAC, just for information. So that's all from my side. Now, over to Salini.
Sir, we have a few questions.
Yeah.
I'll request Pramod sir also to come back online. Yes, sir. So the first question is, can any government issue a sanction or it is only US? So Pramod sir, if you could like to answer that.
Yeah, thank you, Shalini. Yes, certainly. Every government has, in its own right, can issue sanctions within its own country because each government is sovereign in its country and it can issue laws depending on its own interests. The only difference is which governments can effectively see that world over the sanctions are observed and followed by the entire financial system and commercial system. There, of course, US has got a leverage over rest of the world. Just to give an example, though not related to sanctions, you would have heard of FATCA. That was taken, initiative was taken only by the US in the beginning, and it really imposed obligations on the financial institutions across the world, though US has no jurisdiction over them. But everybody tended to comply because the punitive power, the measure introduced was that 30% of any transactions done by those financial institutions which landed with US system, financial system would be blocked. So that's why US sanctions are more known, but EU, UK, as we have already seen, sanctions are there, Canada, Australia, etc. Thank you. Over to you, Shalini.
The next question is from Sachindra Rai sir. Whether OFAC sanction would be applicable to a bank incorporated in a country outside USA?
Yes, because if it will be applicable to that particular bank, if the particular bank has a correspondent banking relationship with any bank who is processing the US dollar denominated transactions. So wherever there is a processing of US dollar denominated transactions, this OFAC sanction will be applicable.
Okay, sir. So another question for OFAC, whether OFAC sanction worries only the banks or other industries as well, and how?
So just I think I have covered in my slide. After 9/11, they have changed the definition of financial institution, and they have included many other industries as well. So the OFAC sanction is applicable not only to the bank but all other business entities as defined in the US Patriot Act. And we have also seen that if you see the quantum of penalty imposed by OFAC in 2020, it was I think 20% was against the traditional bank, even less than that, and the rest more than 80% penalties were levied on the other organizations which are not financial institutions. So how it impacts that, if you are dealing with the US person, if you are dealing in US dollar, then they have the power, then you fall under the net of the OFAC and they can levy penalty. So that this is how it will be impacting the international trade wherever it is being done in currency denominated in a dollar, or a trade is being done, anything is related to the US, if involved in that particular transactions, the OFAC sanction applies.
Okay, sir. Pramod sir, a question for you. How does sanction impact import-export business? And continuing this question, we have another question from a participant. How does economic sanction impact the trades and transaction executed just before imposing the sanctions? Is there any relief provided for such cut-off trades?
Well, how does sanctions impact import-export trade? I think the best situation which can demonstrate this is India's imports from Iran. Iran was the major petroleum supplier largest petroleum supplier to India decades ago. In the earlier regime, India was provided a special concession, but it had to bring down its imports from Iran substantially. Secondly, India had to find out a different manner of settling the payment with Iran because India could not use any of the major currencies because no international banks would handle those transactions. And as you would be aware that an Indian bank which did not have relationship with other correspondent banks was chosen, and this settlement is being done in rupee. Subsequently, even this concession was done away with, that India's imports, petroleum import from Iran have come down to bare minimal to be brought to nil. So definitely the sanctions regime, depending on how severe it is, it could impact. Another situation could be, today if you are major supplier of, say, basmati rice to a country X, and if US decides to bring up a sanction there and not even permitting basmati rice export under the food supplies also, usually that is permitted. Naturally, your trade with that country will go away, and if that country or buyers in those countries were your 50% trade partners, you will have to find alternate buyers. So that's the strict impact which is there. Could you kindly repeat the second part, Shalini?
Yes, sir. The second part says, how does economic sanction impact the trades and transaction executed just before imposing the sanctions? Yeah. Is there any relief provided for such cut-off trades?
Usually when sanctions regime is brought into being, fresh sanctions are imposed, there is a window given for the transactions in pipeline. That's normally the situation, unless in an exceptional case, if transactions, it is brought into effect immediately, then wherewithal how those transactions could be unwound or could be taken care of is provided in the regime, sanctions regime. Perhaps Sachindraji, if he would like to add something more specific on this from a fact sanctions perspective.
Yeah, I think you responded completely, and that's just the case that if any sanction is being imposed, they provide some relief for the transaction and pipeline.
All right, sir. Sir, I'll take forward the question on export import, and I'll ask Sachindra sir, who has the primary responsibility for compliance, whether the bank or the entity who initiates export import? If a fine is imposed on bank for transaction of Indian client with a sanctioned country or entity, whether it is recoverable from the Indian client, and will the violation result in criminal action by the Indian law enforcement agencies also?
Yeah. So it's a very good question and very practical question. So the first part of the question is that who is primarily responsible. So as we have already discussed that OFAC is not looking on a banking and financial institution to follow the sanctions, but also they have expanded the definition of financial institution and included almost everybody, like importer and exporter. If they have included importer and exporter, to largely all international trade is covered. Besides that, they have included many other industries also. So if you are covered in that, then you are the primarily responsible. Who is violating? Bank is violating. Bank is actually not a violating sanction. Bank is processing your transactions, importer or exporter transactions. So in fact, the importer or exporter is violating. What is the fault on the bank side? The bank has not stopped. Our bank should not have processed the transactions. Transaction was initiated by an importer or exporter. So the penalty will be levied on the bank as well as on those who importer exporter who have initiated transactions. That is the answer of the first part. The answer of second part is that whether bank can recover the penalty from the client, from the customer, This is a subjective one because whenever if there is a business with a client who have that sanction related exposure or had sanction related business with a sanction comprehensively sanctioned country, generally it is a practice. Is this a best practice that there is an undertaking? The bank asks the customer to sign an undertaking. The customer is not doing any business with the sanctioned countries, and in future if anything is detected and banks get fined, then banks shall have a right to recover the penalty from the customer. So this is not law, this is not a rule, this is a contract between banks and customers. So wherever the customer has signed this letter, the bank has the right to collect the recover the penalty from the customer.
Okay, sir. So I'll move to the next question. So this question comes, a participant wants to know the full form of OFAC and SDN, etc.
Yeah, Pramodji.
OFAC is Office of Foreign Affairs Control. Yes, and SDN is he had mentioned also, I think, specifically designated nationals. So those who are on those lists of the designated persons is used in the context of US, the SDN, because they have non-SDN, SDN, etc. The difference.
All right, sir. So the next question is, what are the duties of citizens who has to deal with the residents of countries on which sanctions are imposed? So Pramod sir, if you would like to answer that.
What are the duties of residents, you said?
Of the citizens who have to deal with the residents of countries on which sanctions are imposed.
Okay. Duties of residents of countries on which sanctions are, they are in fact the victims, I would say, because they have to really bear the hardship. And one could really look at it that citizens in Iraq, when it was under greatest, most strict sanctions regime, in fact, later on, a food for oil program was initiated by US government that permitting Iraq to export oil for just for the purpose of importing food so that its residents can get this. Now, it would be, as far as the countries, target countries are concerned, which are under comprehensive sanctions, I would put, if we were to put ourselves in that situation, they really have to find out the ways and means to go about and live their life with trade, commerce, etc., which is essential for continuance of that country. So they will actually, because they do not have the option of making those persons who are complying with these sanctions to make it violate. So they will naturally find the alternate sources for raising the resources. Again, taking example that for between India and Iran, the rupee settlement, which was being done for import-export related. So how they can really carry out their activities by taken care of within the limited area of commerce and trade available in the world for them. That experts in the finance, in trade, etc., will work out and deal with such other countries where they can do their trade and commerce without getting into transactions in these major currencies like US dollar, EU, and without touching those banking systems of these jurisdictions.
Okay, sir. Sir, I'll take two more questions. The first question is related to sanctions against Afghanistan. So the participants wants to know, are there any sanctions against Afghanistan and are the assets of its central bank frozen?
I think the answer is no. It's not a sanction against Pakistan. Still, I've seen there are trade
Sir,
being
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, yes. So still, I have seen that there are trade happening with Afghanistan.
Okay, sir. So I'll move to the last question. Does software has any role in AML CFT?
Software has a big role. In fact, it is software driven only. So as per FIU India guideline, the banks needs to implement, there are certain scenarios prescribed by FIU. So FIU has prescribed around 174 scenarios. Out of that, 94 scenarios are there which needs to be implemented in a system, and rest of them needs to be monitored manually. And even for those, there are means in ways that you can do through the system. So transaction monitoring system we need to put in place, and that is the software. So that plays a big role. Even for sanction screening also, you need to have some software which allow you to screen your customer against the SDN, the specially designated nexus list. So yes, it's play a lot of role. Now that this is in digital world, we all are going to be dependent on software only. The human resource, the use of the human resource is going to be less and less, and we are going to be more and more dependent on the software and in the digital world. That's going to be future.
Permit, Satyanji, may I supplement a little more?
Yeah,
Yes,
sure.
sir.
I fully agree with Satyanji. Software does play the core and major role. In fact, even going beyond the RFIs, which Satyanji had mentioned, and FIU has only talked about having software for this. But going forward in the realm of AML CFT, use of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and even evolving these RFIs into scenario-based situations is going to really play a major role. But having said that, in AML CFT, the core and final decision of a suspicious transaction for which transaction monitoring, all these tech capabilities are going to be used, they are essentially meant to help the human resource in taking that final decision about whether the transaction is suspicious. And that decision can only be taken by human skills. So developing the skills of those AML personnel who finally conclude based on these software alerts and software analysis, etc., that whether or not to report the transaction is going to be very crucial. Particularly in the context, this is no more the situation of take the safest route, if in doubt, file STR. Because frivolous STRs, the regulators are not liking. So they want that we should be able to take prudent judgment justified by all information and application of mind.
Sir, I was on the last two questions. In the meanwhile, I have received a few more. Would you be happy to give another 10 minutes and maybe answer those as well?
Yeah, I think.
Aim for it. Secondly, he has time. He is a busy person in corporate world right now.
I'll go for the question, sir. Sir, the first question is related to the import-export question. It is in continuation. The question says, if the first entity who imports or exports goods from or to India does not reveal the ultimate user of goods of service, will the Indian exporter or importer shall be liable for civil or criminal liabilities?
This is again a difficult question. That there is a limit to conducting a due diligence. Up to what extent you can do. For example, if somebody sitting in Australia importing something from India, and in between as a high sea sale, they are selling somebody to Iran, and on which if the Indian exporter has no control, then of course Indian exporter will not held liable. But if the Indian exporter knowingly that the ultimate destination of the goods is going to be the Iran or any comprehensively sanctioned country, then yes, the bank in India who is processing the transactions and the exporter as well, both will be liable.
All right, sir. So I'll move to the next question. It says, what about foreign nationals living and working in a sanctioned country? Is it permissible, for example, for an Indian national to go and take up employment in such a country? And what all approvals shall be needed if a person makes remittances to their home country, to their family, or vice versa?
This is again a difficult question. That there is a limit to conducting a due diligence. Up to what extent you can do. For example, if somebody sitting in Australia importing something from India, and in between importing something to Iran, and on which if the Indian exporter has no control, then of course Indian exporter will not held liable. But if the Indian exporter knowingly that the ultimate destination of the goods is going to be the Iran or any comprehensively sanctioned country, then yes, the bank in India who is processing the transactions and the exporter as well, both will be liable. So again, and this I have covered in during the deliberation, that if suppose if you are going to be employed by a company in a comprehensively sanctioned country, OFAC gives some license or some authorizations to do certain transactions. For example, I will give you, quote you a example. Suppose there is a pharmaceutical company in India. So if they are importing drugs even to the comprehensively sanctioned country, that is something which is allowed, because that is the OFAC sanctions permit. Or if the particular industry has applied to OFAC and got some license or authorization, they when they give license or authorization, they specify the volume of transactions and the value of transactions. Within that you can do. So accordingly, if the person has taken the employment in the comprehensively sanctioned country, and if there is such arrangement there, then that is fine. If that is not, then the person will not be able to do the transaction denominated in the US dollar. For example, if you are posted in Iran, you can do the remittances in INR, you can do remittances in all other currency which are not sanctioned, but you will not be able to do the transaction in US dollar. Or if the EU has sanctioned, then you will not be able to do the transaction in euro. So, so all those currencies you cannot use, but you can use the other currencies.
Okay, sir. So the next question is, when foreign remittances are received for priority products from US banned countries such as Sudan or Iran on commodities, etc., and when such deliverables cannot be completed in time, permissions sought for return of funds received are not approved by AD banks unless RBI prior approvals are obtained. While such permissions are to be obtained only by AD banks, ADs like in Iran, which deal only with rupee transactions and not in US dollars, what are the remedies for the Indian receiver of funds to return the funds back?
I think the question is not a bit clear. Can you read it again?
I'll do that, sir. When foreign remittances are received for priority products from US banned countries such as Sudan or Iran on commodities, etc., and when such deliverables cannot be completed in time, permissions sought for return of funds received are not approved by AD banks unless RBI prior approvals are obtained. While such permissions are to be obtained only by the ADs, like in Iran, which deals only with rupee transactions and not US dollars, what are the remedies for the Indian receiver of funds to return the funds back?
So see, if the first thing is that this incoming of the fund cannot be in US dollar. If it is comprehensively sanctioned country, it will be in some other currency which is not sanctioned. And if you have received a certain amount in other currency which is not sanctioned, accordingly, if you don't get approval from RBI for that, then you can return that. Nobody is going to stop you. So neither the incoming of the fund should be in a currency which is a sanctioned one, neither the outgoing of the fund should be in the currency which is sanctioned one. For example, I have seen the cases where in India, the person is importing dry fruits from Iran. There is a general store which is importing dry fruit from Iran. So Reserve Bank of India has designated IDBI bank to deal with the transaction with the Iran. So thus you can, like, the person can go to IDBI and do the necessary transaction. IDBI will not be doing the transaction in US dollar. They will be doing certain arrangements and make the payment by utilizing the Indian rupees only. So they cannot touch the USD for making payment to the Iran or any comprehensively sanctioned country by the OFAC.
Okay, sir. So the software question, one more, extension to that. It says Iran transactions do not permit software as any priority. Why is that so? And likewise, only UCO Bank is the authorized bank in India for Iran transactions. Why is that so? Pramod sir, if you can explain that.
First part I have not really followed. Could you
The
repeat
question
that?
is the question is that why only UCO Bank is the authorized bank in India for Iran related transactions, and why Iran does not permit software as any priority?
UCO Bank being the channelizing bank, the reason is, as I said earlier, and Satyajit told now, the issue for India to handle the transactions with Iran basically is these transactions cannot be done in any major currencies of the world. That is mainly EU or US dollar, or rather, to put it more precisely, they cannot be done using any of these financial systems, means a EU bank or a British bank or a US banking financial system. Therefore, India had to evolve a mechanism that one, such an institution handles these transactions, which will not be impacted, whose correspondent relationship will not be impacted because it is not much into the global transactions. Secondly, it is handled only in rupee. Now, when you settle only in rupee, rupee is not a convertible currency. So usually how this settlement happens, with Iran, we will have both import and export. These remittances, Iran has been a similar with Russian trade between that type of bilateral settlement. And that is why otherwise transactions would not be feasible at all. All transactions will be blocked by the financial system. Now, as for why Iran is not putting software as a priority, now basically the reasons could be many. For that, we will have to, because the question is more about what Iran has categorized, and we got to understand the Iran's ecosystem. Now, for Iran, what they need, because their need today would be more on their regular requirements, and maybe software is not on that priority aspect if it is about export of software to Iran. They would consider their other requirements of regular consumption needs, the construction there, they need to do the regular medicines and all other general requirements to carry on the commerce and trade, and software would be on their second priority. Sachin could add further his thoughts to this.
Yeah, I think you have covered. And the reason for software not being a priority product is that import or export of software is more susceptible to the money laundering even, because you cannot value a software. If I have written a code, that is my code, I can value it 1 crore, I can value it 1000 crore. Nobody can question that why I am selling my software that is useless software in 1000 crore. So this is very susceptible to the money laundering. We have seen the example even in India. I will not name it. In Hyderabad, there was a company running in one room with the one guard, and that's one table and chair. And there are 56 companies registered at that particular address, and they were doing just this. They download the freely available software from the Google, write it on the CD, and export that. So this is something which is very susceptible. Even nowadays, let me tell you the current situation. The Enforcement Directorate is investigating a huge number of cases wherein thousands and thousands crore of money has been laundered and sent abroad on the pretext of the import of the software. So it's very susceptible to the money laundering as well. That's maybe one of the reason why this is not a priority product. Even no government is going to like allowed with the country which is a comprehensively sanctioned country, like they import the software and all.
So thank you so much, sir, Satindra sir and Pramod sir. Thank you for sparing your valuable time and sharing your knowledge with our participants here today on this webinar on economic sanctions. So thanks once again on behalf of the Committee on Economic Commercial Laws and Economic Advisory and the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.